Hallo og velkommen til Pengeland, en podcast om økonomiens skyggesider. Jeg er her i studio, og Kaja er også her. Hallo, Kaja.
Ja, jeg er her også.
I dag har vi det vi vil påstå er en etterlengtet episode.
Absolutt.
Til vår harde kjerne i hvert fall, av fans. For vi har jo teaset denne episoden en stund, at vi skal snakke om land-for-land-rapportering. Og nå skjer det. Og det er veldig kult at vi da har med oss en legende innenfor land-for-land-rapportering, Jason Ward, som har jobbet med land-for-land-rapportering i Australia, som vi har dekket ganske mye på våre nettsider. Så vi er veldig, veldig glad for at han nå er i Oslo, og med på en del arrangementer som vi har, og også da med å spille inn podcast, som er veldig kult. Så han sitter allerede her i studio, så vi skal ikke bruke så mye tid på den norske introen. Men det vi i hvert fall kan si er at land-for-land-rapportering er jo en av på en måte kjerneaktivitetene som Tax Justice Norge jobber for, og hele Tax Justice-bevegelsen jobber for. Fordi selv om navnet er litt kjedelig, så er det den viktigste tingen for å få på plass for å ansvarliggjøre store selskaper, sånn at de betaler den skatten de skal. Og det er jo da, bare for å ta det veldig kort, det er jo en ny måte å tenke på hvordan selskaper er åpne om sine skattebidrag og sin økonomiske aktivitet, hvor de må levere en rapport hvor de gir en oversikt over indikatorer på økonomisk aktivitet, type antall salg de har i et land, antall ansatte de har i et land, fysisk kapital, inntekt, åpenbart, og overskudd, men også skatt da. Så du får se om det er noe viktig avvik mellom skatten de betaler i et land og den økonomiske aktiviteten som skjer der. Og hvis vi får dette på plass, så vil jo det være en helt ny måte at befolkningen, og også investorer spesielt, politikere spesielt, kan holde store selskaper ansvarlige og jobbe for å tette de hullene som gjør at overskuddsflytting er så stort som det aldri har vært før, sånn som det er i dag.
Ja, fordi vi vet jo at sånn rundt 60% av de pengene som går tapt i skatteinntekter, går jo nettopp tapt til typ store selskaper som driver med litt snuskede, litt gråsoneaktivitet. Så hvis man får på plass dette åpenhetstiltaket, som land-for-land-rapportering er, så er det mye enklere for alle å se hvordan selskapene faktisk driver sin aktivitet, hvor de betaler skatten, og om det er den sammenhengen mellom stedet for økonomisk aktivitet og stedet for skattebetaling. Så tanken i dag er at det skal være en litt sånn introduksjonsepisode. Vi skal virkelig sette land for land på agendaen, men så håper vi også å få høre mer og lære mer fra Jason om det australske eksempelet da.
Og det australske eksempelet er jo kjempeinteressant, fordi der har de faktisk fått til land for land-rapportering. I hvert fall, det er ikke vedtatt ennå i parlamentet, men en utrolig interessant historie som jeg gleder meg til at Jason skal fortelle om, hvordan Arbeiderpartiet i Australia og arbeiderbevegelsen og fagbevegelsen gikk til valg i 2022 på land-for-land-rapportering og ansvarliggjøre store selskaper, sånn at de betaler riktig skatt. Og det er en veldig interessant parallell til hva vi håper å få til i Norge med det samme tiltaket, fordi vi har stortingsvedtak for offentlig land-for-land-rapportering. Nå bare venter vi på at de skal følges opp. Trenger vi å si noe mer? Nå er det bare å slippe Jason til, tenker jeg.
Ja. Welcome, Jason. Very nice to have you here. We're thinking you can just start by introducing yourself and a little bit about your background and why you're here today.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. My name is Jason Ward. I'm the principal analyst of an organization called CICTAR, the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. It's
rolls off the tongue.
Quite a mouthful, but we're stuck with that name for now, for better or worse.
What is it that you say it's better than ICRICT?
It's better than ICRICT, which is I can't even remember, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Tax. So a lot of the same words, but
just switched around.
Switched around. And, they have a lot of high-powered and well-known economists, and we're a bit more scrappy. And but they focus on policy issues, whereas we focus on sort of campaign exposés and mobilization in order to support the policy issues. So it's quite a good partnership relationship. But SICTAR has been around now for about 6 years, and we started as an international center when it was just me, but now we are truly international, and we've got people working now besides myself in Australia. We have people in the UK, in Brazil, and in New Zealand, and working on projects. We've done a bit of work in Norway and across several European countries, the UK, Canada, US, Kenya, Colombia, Brazil, and some other countries which I can't I can't discuss. But I think we've been doing. We started in Australia, and we've sort of done the most work and have the longest track record there. But this year we've dramatically expanded our work across the global south, and very happy to be doing that. We have very, very strong links with the trade union movement around the world, and it's sort of a partnership that we are kind of a bridge between trade unions and the tax justice movement worldwide, and we try to provide a tool for unions to win on their policy fights, their organizing, bargaining by exposing multinational tax avoidance, or in some cases looking at multinationals or maybe even nonprofits that are winning government contracts and holding them accountable. So I'm very glad we have the accountable word in our name, and it's there. That's there for a very specific reason. But yeah, we do sort of detailed forensic analysis that helps drive the policy debates, and hopefully, in doing so, we help workers kind of win in the fights that they're embarking on in different sectors or with different companies.
Yeah, we already teased it a bit in the intro, but a reason why we wanted to invite you today is because you've been so deeply involved with the work in Australia and with the labor unions to really bring forth a new initiative for public country-by-country reporting. So just to start off, I'm not an expert on this. It's more Jonas who's experienced with the CBCR, as we call it. But could you just explain very easily what is public country-by-country reporting?
Sure. So country-by-country reporting has been around now for a number of years, and is something that is done in confidence through the OECD. And it requires all multinationals to report on a country-by-country basis, basically key financial details of how they operate, how many employees, what are the revenues, profits, taxes paid, losses. And so it's kind of a very quick snapshot of a country's presence in all countries in which it operates. So sadly, I mean, and we know from tax authorities that information has been hugely helpful in guiding their work and helping them focus on where the greatest, I'm just going to say, theft has occurred from multinational companies. But it has limited use. There's only a certain number of OECD countries that have access to that data. And so most of the countries in the global south that need to collect the revenue from multinationals and have the least resources to do so have no access whatsoever to this information. Civil society organizations, academics have no access to this information, and investors who own the company also have no access to that information. So we want the information to be public so that all of those stakeholders can use it and truly understand what's going on. And it's not a measure that will lead directly to bringing in revenue, but it is a measure that will lead to more reforms to close the loopholes that will bring in the revenue, and it will drive corporate change, because once companies have to disclose the nasty tricks that they're up to and how they're shifting money into tax havens, there will be greater public scrutiny and calls for them to change that behavior, and they may change the behavior before it actually has to be reported. It will, inform further reforms that are needed to, fix the system and close existing loopholes.
For sure. And as you mentioned, obviously this has value already for tax authorities and for other public authorities that are working with companies and taxation. But I wanted to ask if you can also detail, because you say there's a lot of other actors who might also be interested in this. You worked with unions and with labor unions. What is the reason why this is important for the labor union movement? And then also, why is it important for investors?
Right. So for unions in particular, I mean, for public sector unions whose work is financed by this, there's an obvious direct connection. If multinationals aren't paying what they should, there's no money for education, healthcare, and all the public services that we need, and frankly, that those companies need in order to survive and compete and grow. In terms of private sector unions who may actually work for these multinational companies, if a multinational company in Norway, Australia, or anywhere can go to the tax authority and say, it's been a really tough year and we didn't make any money here, then how are you going to bargain for additional wages and benefits from a company that has told the government it's losing money? When in fact, when we're able to look at the finances, we can determine that they're making plenty of money. It's just been they're using profit shifting techniques, which sadly are still legal, and moving that money into tax, and from higher tax jurisdictions into low tax jurisdictions or places where it's not taxed at all. And I think it's important that these tax havens are not just small Caribbean islands. These are the city of London, Delaware, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Ireland. So it's not a phenomena that is about Bermuda and the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. This is a truly a global problem with global implications. In terms of investors, there's lots of different ways that this information affects investors. Increasingly, there's a risk problem because there's lots of cases where investors are now being burnt because the company that they own is being forced to, their dirty deeds that have been going on for perhaps decades are being enforced. So a few examples of that are Microsoft is facing a $30 billion tax bill from the U.S. tax authority, as is Coca-Cola is facing a $16 billion tax bill, and another company a little bit less known than the other two called Amgen, which is a major pharmaceutical company, is also facing a $3 billion tax bill from the IRS. And increasingly, we see this kind Apple just lost its court case in Ireland. Yeah. And so, investors are going to have to eat those losses. And
that was a $13 billion, I think, 13, 14.
Yeah.
Not counting interest, which comes later, I guess.
Yeah. So, those are impacts themselves. But I think we have a lot of investors that are what are called universal investors and investing across the economy. And so if you have companies that, let's just pick a Microsoft or an Amazon or an Apple, all three of those work very well, right? These are companies that really have built into a situation of monopoly power, and you're stifling innovation and competition, and you're getting companies competing on the basis of who can best exploit a tax loophole, not on who can best produce a good product. And the evidence of bad products and domination in Microsoft is pretty clear for anybody who's ever used Teams or Outlook, or we're stuck using these things not because they're good, but because of monopoly power. And the ability to bend the tax rules in your favor is just another example of how that kind of corporate power shapes society in quite negative ways.
Yeah, so investors are pushing for this to some degree, right? There are some shareholder, what do you call them?
Resolutions.
Which gain 15 to 30% every year on the for big companies. But in addition to voting in the company itself, many are also signing petitions and trying to make governments impose regulations for country-by-country reporting, because that won't just focus on the individual company, but also create a level playing field in the given country, right? And I know the reason we have you here, or we are very glad to have you here, is that we have been very inspired by the work you've done in Australia, right? With country-by-country reporting and especially working with the labor unions and the Labour Party to promote and get this through Parliament. Could you talk us through what you did in Australia. We want to learn from you. We want to do the same.
So it has been a very long process with us pushing for public country-by-country reporting for a very long time. We did get it as a platform of the Labour Party in the previous election, where sadly the Labour Party lost. And then recently they won and they're now in office, and also while some tax reform measures left the platform, that one thankfully remained in the platform. And so now I was hoping to be here to say that the legislation had passed and is implemented, but it's not quite there yet, but we do have that legislation. So let me step back again. The legislation was initially introduced more than a year ago, and it was exactly what we wanted. It was following what's called the GRI tax standard, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. And so it was developed through a long process with lots of engagement from investors, unions, civil society, and came up with a standard that is really the gold standard in terms of kind of how public country-by-country reporting should be done. And we had that legislation written, and it was pulled at the last minute because of opposition from the OECD, who wanted to preserve their central role in sort of global tax discussions, negotiations. And it was opposed by, obviously, lots of multinationals who wanted to keep their dirty deeds in the dark and didn't want to be exposed to what was going on. And certain governments intervened and, made threats about not exchanging the confidential information, which would have been highly detrimental to tax collection from multinationals in Australia. So that legislation was sent back and then revised. So the version we have now is not as strong as we had hoped for, but it still would be the best standard in the world. And it would require companies, it would encourage all companies to do the full public country-by-country reporting on every country that they operate in. But what it will require is disclosure in a list of about 40 or so countries that I think everybody would agree are widely considered to be the most abused tax haven. We're tinkering around the edges in terms of trying to make sure that we want Puerto Rico included, which is foreign for U.S. taxing purposes and a major destination. Many of the cases that I mentioned, Microsoft, that's centered on using Puerto Rico. So there's a parallel process that has already happened in the EU as well, but the EU country-by-country reporting directive was actually written by the French corporate lobby group and has so many loopholes and exemptions in it. And it only requires, so the EU has a ridiculous list of kind of quote-unquote blacklist or tax haven countries that frankly is made up almost half by small Pacific Island nations that couldn't afford to send a lobbyist to Brussels to get themselves off the list. And so this is not capturing the activity of multinational profit shifting. So our list is superior. It includes, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, and all of the usual suspects as well.
It's super interesting to hear you talk about this, and also like watching this unfold in Australia last year when we got reports of what was happening with the OECD lobbying, because this is like. To someone who's interested in like global power play, this is like this is super interesting because it seems like such a technical idea. I mean, country by country reporting, and of course it started as an idea from the tax justice movement, right? The idea of country by country reporting, like public country by country reporting, you didn't have to say the public because it was built in, right? The idea is that you publish this. Of course, because I mean we have it's a whole thing in Norway that there have been series of reports on the tax administration not prioritizing audits, and so if they're the only ones seeing these reports, we are essentially relying on them having the capacity and priority to use them. But if it's public, then everybody can see it and scrutinize companies. But then, so the idea was always it should be public, and then came sort of the OECD standard, which sort of defined country-by-country reporting anew. So now we have to say public country-by-country reporting when we discuss what we want to achieve, right? And it's so interesting that they got the definition power, what you call it. They set the agenda now.
Power,
yeah. And so when Australia tries to implement public country-by-country reporting, they come in as sort of this huge power player and tries to stop it. And that's like the sentence, the OECD is lobbying the Australian government, sounds so bizarre, because I didn't know that was something the OECD did. But of course it's informal and all that, but it's such a strange turn of events. And it really shows, like, we are of course very working a lot on trying to move negotiations for the global tax system over to the UN, because we see it as fair. Of course, there are problems there too, but the OECD really shows itself as this power player, which is fighting for corporate interests in this case, which is it's so strange. Yeah, that was a tangent. But I was the question I was heading to. I don't have a great transition. Is what makes the Australian country-by-country reporting better than first of all the OECD, but also the EU, because the EU is something we have to deal a lot with in Norway, which we might get back to.
Well, let me come back to that, but just a few comments on the OECD process. I mean, it's in the past, the OECD has sort of set a floor, not a ceiling. And this is basically imposing a ceiling, saying you can't go beyond the floor that we've set, which is not how the OECD has operated in the past. It's sort of, it serves a good purpose to sort of lift the standards, but to stop people from going beyond that is a bit unheard of. But Australia has, in terms of people, two very terrible exports. The first being Rupert Murdoch. Sorry. Apologies for that. And the second being Matthias Cormann, who's now the Secretary General of the OECD, right? And this man was a climate denial person, cigar-chomping, corporate tax-cutting beast and corrupt. Like, I'm just, there were allegations, well, not allegations. He was receiving shares in a company by the former president of PwC Australia, who's embroiled in a huge scandal. And this is the man who's now dictating the OECD's direction and policy. And he is a corporate lackey, right? He's doing corporate bidding and has always done the work of standing up and representing the rights of the downtrodden multinational corporations, right? And the person who's now running the head of tax was part of KMPG, who sold the tax scheme of shifting $30 billion and a lot more than $30 billion into Puerto Rico. And so what kind of faith can you have in that type of organization where its interests are aligned with corporations much more than civil society people and, the needs of governments to collect revenue to provide public services. So sorry, I responded to your tangent there.
No,
I felt it necessary.
That was better than the question, I think.
But in terms of the sort of concrete differences between Australia and the EU and the OECD, I think the definitions, like the GRI standard was an improvement and built upon the OECD standard. And like,
could you quickly explain the GRI standard?
So the GRI standard was specifically designed for public use. And so it kind of takes that into consideration versus something that is kind of behind the scenes and behind closed doors. And it looks at metric, like there's more detail in there that is useful to analyze, like in terms of related party transactions, and the metrics and the measurements are a slight improvement over the OECD, but more or less it's very similar. And so again, there's not companies, it's the compliance burden is going to be to all these different standards, but in reality, you're putting together that information and there's a minor tweaks between minor technical tweaks between the GRI standard and the OECD standard.
Yeah.
That's something we always say is that if a company can't provide this information, they can't operate.
You've got bigger problems than this.
Bigger problems,
And we had companies in Australia arguing like, it's too much burden, but then proposing an alternative that it would actually really be a burden. Because we wanted to report on a regional basis and not on a country. It was like, well, do you aggregate do you currently collect that information that way? No. But the major difference between EU and Australia, and the EU Tax Observatory has an excellent analysis that looks in very, very much more detail in terms of explaining what the differences are in broad strokes. But the key differences are the EU public country by country has so many loopholes and exemptions and it has a much higher threshold to be included that lots and lots of companies will be not included in it because they've said, they can basically say this is going to hurt our business if we report that. And I'll come back to one example of a company that tried to push that line in Australia. But the EU requires reporting on EU member states and this very small and inadequate list of, tax haven countries. And the threshold is higher. So the reporting is only on EU member states and this small list, whereas we'll have a much broader coverage in Australia because we have this bigger and more robust list of tax haven countries that will be required to be reported on. And in Australia, any multinational that has revenue in Australia over $10 million, which is actually the sort of definition of existing definition of a small business. So if you're below that, you're excluded, and fair enough. But if you're above that, then you will be obliged to report. And we have got the reporting will be centralized, and so all of the data will be reported in a consistent basis and be hosted on a government website. So you'll be able to collect this data, from one source and comparable.
Okay. So just sort of to I guess simplify the idea of country by country reporting as it ideally should be is that of course you should have enough information to actually see like the tax
the realities of
the realities of their taxes and their economic activity. But then also you should have it for every country. That's like that's where we're at, right? That in the EU it's only for EU countries and like these small tax havens. And for Australia, even though the ambition was there a year ago, now it's still very strong because it's the biggest tax havens, or a list of like 40 good tax havens to have on such a list.
A good list.
Yeah. And I guess what we're going to come back to that a bit later, but what we should aim for in Norway and also in other places is to have every country, right? Because otherwise you just shift your activities to those countries which are not. You might create new tax havens.
That's an incentive to create a new tax haven. I mean, I think the utility of, like in very simple terms, the utility of public country by country reporting is to be able to very quickly and easily identify the mismatch between real economic activity and fake or on paper economic activity. And the most simple way of looking at that is sort of profits per employee. And so it's not Bermuda shorts or Panama hats that increase productivity, right? This is tax planning and tax scheming and profit shifting that increase productivity. We looked at one Australian company that's a multinational, and it was the only Australian company to really come out publicly against, advocate against public country, and they actually do their own version of. Country by country reporting, but they pick 6 countries and they don't report related party transactions. They've created their own standard that works for them. And by looking at that information, we basically determined that the profit per employee numbers, this is an Australian company, was a government-owned company that was privatized in the past. The Swiss employees were 10 times more in profit per employee than the Australian employees. And I think that the working standards in Switzerland are probably significantly higher than they are in Australia. So this wasn't a matter of low employment standards. It's clearly a matter of using loopholes in the Swiss tax regime. And this company is one of the top companies on the stock market in Australia, yet consistently reports low revenues or losses and pays very little tax in Australia, but also pays very little tax in every other country in which it operates as well.
I think so. The way I see it, CBCR, country-by-country reporting, is very essential to just get this transparency, to really see the way that multinationals structure themselves, and to then also see where they pay their taxes, and also understand why they can pay so little, because they're using the loopholes, as you say, and they're structuring themselves with that purpose. You can, of course, challenge that in court or not, but at least if you have this measure in place, you can see it. And if you can see it, you can also have accountability, right? But then I wanted to take it even one step further. What can you do with that information? And when you start to think of companies in this way and seeing the way that they're they're functioning multinationally and not on a country level alone, they actually cooperate with themselves between. What does that imply for the way that we do taxation today? And obviously, I'm hinting at unitary taxation. I might as well just throw that word out there. But do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the public country-by-country reporting is a means, a very, very important means to an end. And the short-term version of that is closing the loopholes that allow companies, the legal loopholes that allow companies to have the profits in a low-tax jurisdiction and avoid taxes everywhere else. The long-term solution, and I think public country-by-country gets us closer to there, because when people see what really is going on underneath, the sort of the darkness that we don't have access to now, it will drive a demand for really reforms. And where we need to go is absolutely unitary taxation. No company looks at it's like the fictition of a corporate structure. No company kind of looks at its corporate structure. It's not a logical, rational structure. It's a structure designed to exploit loopholes and shift profits. But if we're looking at a unitary tax that says, okay, Apple made, X tens of billions of dollars in profits, and where did it have sales, or where did it have production sites, and then distributing the kind of taxing rights based on genuine economic activity, that's where we need to go. It's much simpler, cleaner, easier, transparent, and it helps to begin to level the playing field, particularly like lots of global north tax authorities don't have the resources to do the job that they need to do. I mean, I'd say particularly in the UK with the HMRC and in the US with the IRS, these are grossly under-resourced organizations that can't chase, and public country-by-country reporting also holds the governments accountable to make sure that they're doing the job that they need to be doing to collect the revenues that should be paid.
I mean, the unitary taxation is a very intuitive idea if presented right. It's like as you mentioned in a conversation we had before the podcast, like Apple thinks of itself as Apple, right? It's one thing. It's unitary. The approach it has is a hierarchical one, right?
Yeah.
You have on top Tim Cook or the guys, in the leadership, and then information flows. I don't know, remember
from
how
the
you say.
Subsidiaries.
Yeah. All the subsidiaries are fictions, sort of. You can call them that, at least for anything other than tax purposes, right? And we think of these companies as unitary. We think of Apple as Apple, right? We don't think that there are 100 or 200 companies, subsidiaries under them, which is about the size of it, I think. But what happens is that they're placed all around, and you get these because you treat each subsidiary as its own separate tax entity or entity for purposes of taxation. You end up with all this, what is essentially moving money between bank accounts, only their subsidiaries in different countries, and you get to lower the tax burden quite substantially. What's really interesting about the country-by-country idea is that it connects so well to the way of thinking about unitary taxation, because then you look away from all the subsidiaries. You don't think of Apple as 100 or 200 companies. You think of Apple as a global conglomerate or a unitary actor, and then you think of all the countries where they are or operating. And then you say, well, you have this much profit, and you had this much activity in this country. That means they should have this percentage of the apportionment or the tax, and whatever the country decides to tax is based on their tax policy. I had no question.
On the unitary tax system, I think it's important to it sounds like a complicated thing, but actually in reality it's a very simple, clear, easy concept that fits the realities. And it does already exist. There are 27 states in the United States that already use a form of unitary taxation. So this is not a hypothetical thing. This is something that actually happens already. So there are certain problems that we'll attempt to work with allies to fix at the state level in the United States in 2025 to close some loopholes that are part of that unitary system. And the U.S. system is based in large part solely on the sales tax, which works within the United States, but is not the way that you would apply a unitary system on a global basis, because you need to take into consideration sort of labor in particular as a determination of who has the taxing rights.
Does that make it so that Delaware is not a tax haven inside of the U.S.?
It certainly does, right?
Wow.
So it makes it so you can't
mind blown.
So this is called combined reporting, and what we want to move towards is worldwide combined reporting.
Yeah, okay.
And so some companies in these 27 U.S. states, you can elect or not elect to do worldwide. So there's an exemption called the water's edge. And if you elect, you can only include your income from within the 50 United States. So Delaware is included. Puerto Rico, not so much. It depends. It varies. There are some states that do include Puerto Rico. But if you're Nike and all of your profits are in the Netherlands, then you pay nothing in state-level corporate income tax because you've shifted your profits there, and it puts it out of the formula.
Across the water's edge.
Across the water's edge, right.
But I think another thing about unitary taxation that is interesting is that obviously when you present it as an idea, it challenges the very foundational ways of thinking of taxation globally, because it is so national.
Yeah.
But then it's the only thing that makes sense, and we see this recognized also, as you said, in the United States, but even in the EU, there's been propositions for the CCCTB, Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, and then later on the BEFIT, and then also in the OECD, even their own propositions of how to better tax huge digital or companies that have a lot of digital activity, cross-border. It's based in this new way of thinking that you need to look at the corporate group as a united actor that actually acts for the same purpose, and also position themselves for tax purposes to have the best results throughout the whole group. So it's obviously challenging this way we've been doing taxation, but it seems to be the only way, and it's already happening. It just needs to be, global.
Yep. And public country by country reporting is an essential step to get there.
For sure.
Both to drive the demand for it, but also that's the basis of how you then begin to determine what taxes should be paid where. And we're talking about vast sums of money. If we close this one little loophole in California and force companies to do full worldwide combined reporting, the estimate from the state tax revenue authority, this is not my estimate, this is from a government, it would be $5 billion a year in additional revenue collected by the state of California. And sort of if you apply that on a national basis, then obviously significantly larger, but $5 billion in revenue for California that could be providing desperately needed housing, health, education. And again, this is only you're creating an unlevel playing field, because the small businesses who can't hire a tax advisor, a Big Four auditing firm, and don't have a bank account in a tax haven of choice, they're paying what they should be paying because they can't get out of it. But the largest companies in the world are paying nothing, and that's exacerbating inequality.
Right. So we are very happy that you're here in Oslo, and we are, as we have said, very inspired by the story of what you've been able to achieve through working with labor groups and labor unions and the Labour Party in Australia. We're just wondering, how can we do the same?
Simple question.
Simple question. Yeah, in Norway. Yeah.
Simple. Well, I can't speak to the specifics of Norway, but
I guess starting, how did you do it in Australia?
Yeah.
I mean, so we've been hammering on. We've been doing lots of really direct exposés of what companies are doing, not just in Australia, but in Australia and globally. And we have enough public information, I think, as you do in Norway, like that you do have a higher level of disclosure of what companies pay in taxes in Norway versus most of the rest of the world. And sort of actually going through and using that information and comparing that information now to sort of create the demand and to show what the problem is. It's just my general philosophy that people don't want a policy solution until you can show them what the problem is. Yeah. And the problem, once you show it, is very clear. If the largest companies are avoiding their obligations, then it kind of generates outrage and demand for something to change and fix that problem and create a fairer system. And I mean, I do think it's important to say that the ability for multinationals around the world to get away with this is a fuel for right-wing anti-globalist populism, which is an incredibly dangerous force around the world. Like if people see that a multinational is paying a lower rate of tax than the cleaner who cleans its building, that's horrifying, right? But this is a very clear demonstration of the inequality in the system and how the global tax system just continues to reinforce the rules are written by the multinationals for the multinationals, and the rest of us kind of, our conditions in most countries around the world are declining because there's a fewer number of very large companies that are extracting more and more wealth, and even, I mean, just from a business perspective, that's a terrible, like, how can a small, medium-sized business or a business that actually is doing the right thing and meeting its worker obligations, meeting its tax obligations, how can you compete with a company that is basically rape and pillage around the world?
It's eroding the trust, simply.
Absolutely.
Just like completely practical, why is it helpful for the world that Norway implements it? Norway is a small country. Yeah. Why should we have public country by country reporting?
Yeah, I mean, and Australia is a relatively small country as well, but I think it sets the standard, right? What we need to achieve is global. I mean, we want a global public country-by-country reporting system. That's not going to happen until numerous jurisdictions kind of create a standard, and then it becomes easier. So if Australia and Norway were to go down this route, then it becomes a lot easier to shift the EU and to move progress in the United States and all around the world, and ultimately, through the UN, perhaps in a UN tax convention, to get this as a standard practice everywhere. And what happens, the disclosure in either in Australia or Norway is going to be useful. It's in some ways it's more useful globally than it is domestically, and it kind of gets to the fundamental inequalities in the global tax system because, the Norwegian government, the Australian government, they have this information already. Whether they're using it effectively, we don't necessarily know. I have confidence in both of those tax authorities that they're probably better than many others. But countries in the global south have no access to this information and even fewer resources in order to deal with multinationals. And so having that information out there is a huge tool for them to actually collect the revenue that is due. And they are much more reliant upon that revenue than other countries. Like corporate income tax in the global south is a significantly larger percentage of the total tax
Yeah.
revenue than it is in most OECD countries.
For sure. So I guess we can go towards the end, but if you want to just kind of sum up or even look a bit forwards, what part do you think the Australian story here play into this larger momentum around the world for more tax transparency?
Yeah, I think my hope and my very strong belief is that once one jurisdiction does this, and it begins to sort of, there's a trend that's showing we're going to converge on an international standard. I mean, unilateral action is needed in order to get to a multilateral solution, and frankly, the multilateral solution won't happen unless you create a bit of chaos and noise in the process to get there. And at some point, the corporate and the political resistance from certain governments representing corporate interests disappears, because if you're required to do this in Australia or in Norway or in both, then why would you then resist having to do this? Like, the information's there, you've done the work, there's no arguments against it, everyone's doing it.
Sets the standard.
Yeah, why are you going to oppose that when you're already doing it somewhere else? And so we're very keen to have conversations with tax authorities, in countries across the global south as well. So why shouldn't, a Kenya or a Pakistan or a Bangladesh follow Australia's lead and also do public country-by-country reporting? And we strongly hope that Norway can push further than Australia and actually require full public country-by-country reporting, not kind of restricted geographically. It's a better geographical restriction, but it's still a geographical restriction, and what we need is full and transparent disclosure everywhere.
And the power of unilateralism here is so interesting, right? Because as we've spoken about earlier, if just Norway does this, or if just Australia does this, that creates a lot more transparency all around the world, because any in-scope company would have to report on their activities in other countries as well, including the global south, right? So that would be like an incredibly powerful thing that we can implement in Norway or in Australia, and still would affect a lot of places all around the world. And another aspect of the unilateral argument is that the aim might be something similar. We might critique the result, but something similar to what we got with the two-pillar solution, right? Because
from the OECD.
From the OECD, right? Which essentially had stagnated after BEPS, and then so many countries started implementing digital services taxes, unilateral measures all around the world, or for themselves, and that even got like Donald Trump to the negotiating table in the OECD to push for the two-pillar solution. So that speaks to the power of like unilateralism to push forward for multilateral measures. So really.
I think that the digital service tax is a fantastic example, because it pushed. The corporations were then saying, no, we can't, because if you have 30 different digital services tax, each slightly different in different countries, that does create a problem for them, and they'd much rather have one multilateral. But had that not happened before, they would have continued their incredibly staunch opposition rather than championing a multilateral solution.
Right.
And I do think that behind the scenes, particularly in the United States, they sort of champion a multilateral solution, but then turn around and quietly lobby to not have it pass the United States. And having that ambiguity and uncertainty is actually
still a power play.
It's a power play.
Always.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. This is super inspiring, super helpful, and also a bit depressing, of course, because of global politics. But it's a lot of fun, anyways. So we are so happy that you're in Oslo now, and we really appreciate the work you do at Siktar.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here in Oslo, and Norway has been a champion of tax transparency around the world, and an example for others to follow on many levels. And the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has been a strong advocate of from the investor perspective for many years, and the fact that you've led the way on tax transparency at the individual and the corporate level is very inspiring as well.
We'll make sure it continues to be like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ja, det var jo veldig spennende.
Ja, det var veldig kult.
Det er alltid veldig fint å ha noen som både kan snakke om detaljer og er veldig kunnskapsrik, men også klarer å liksom se det større bildet og trekke linjene. Og det synes jeg Jason var veldig god på. Og ja, det jeg fikk ut av det her, da, som jeg kan jo litt om land for land, men ikke like mye som deg, er jo nettopp det at når vi vet hvordan det ser ut, både økonomisk aktivitet og skattebetalinger i et konsern på tvers av land, så skjønner vi jo mye mer hvordan pengene flyttes rundt på litt sånn gråsone måter, men også hva vi kan gjøre for å stoppe det. Og igjen, det kan føre til andre endringer, som enhetlig skattlegging eller unitary taxation, som vi snakket om. Ja,
og det er liksom noe som mobiliserer da, når man faktisk ser disse tingene. Og det er en veldig god lærdom egentlig fra Jason, det å snakke om problemene, og faktisk definere enkelttilfeller av problemer, fordi da folk vil jo ikke ha en løsning uten å ha et problem som er årsaken til at vi trenger den løsningen. Så det synes jeg var veldig kult. Og også bare, det var fint å snakke seg gjennom land-for-land-rapportering som en idé, og hva det egentlig betyr. Fordi det er jo det er synd at det heter det, liksom.
Ja, det er et kjedelig navn.
Det er så nerdy. Men det er jo ikke sånn det burde være. Det er jo en grunnleggende endring i hvordan skattesystemet funker, men i retning mer intuisjon, ikke sant? Det er mer intuitivt å tenke land for land enn å tenke datter for datter, måte, som er tilfellet vi har i dag, datterselskap for datterselskap. Og det er mer intuitivt å tenke enhetlig skattlegging enn å tenke at hvert datterselskap skal være selvstendig. Og jeg synes vi fikk gjennom ganske mange perspektiver her, åpenbart hvorfor dette er viktig for skatteinngangen og sånn, men spesielt også, ikke sant, investorperspektivet, arbeiderbevegelsen sitt ønske og liksom situasjonen i lønnsforhandlinger og sånne ting. Det var veldig bra. Jeg synes det var en veldig dekkende episode på noe som er et veldig grunnleggende og viktig tema for tax justice-bevegelsen og tax justice i Norge, men som liksom har ligget litt latent. Da. Ikke sant? Det er ikke oppe i dagen hele tiden. Men vi håper jo å få til disse endringene med de stortingsvedtakene vi har, og liksom mobilisere på det etter hvert.
Og så tenker jeg, det ble sagt, men jeg sier det igjen, det som ble sagt mot slutten her, om at tiltak på nasjonalt nivå som land-for-land-rapportering, det har så enorm effekt også internasjonalt. Så det er virkelig, virkelig burde være på toppen av prioriteringslista, fordi det er ikke noe som bare tjener Norge og norsk skatteinngang, men det vil også kunne bidra til mer åpenhet og også mer ansvarlighet hele verden over.
Ja, så sant. Ja, det er vel, vi trenger ikke å si noe mer enn det. Vi er så pent kledd i dag, Kaja. Det er ikke hver dag. Håper folk ser på YouTube på denne episoden for å se liksom hvor proffe vi ser ut i dag.
Nytt.
Men ja.
Blir kanskje ikke likt neste gang.
Nei, busy dag. Men ja, vi kan vel si at det var det vi rakk for denne episoden av Pengeland. Vår gjest i studio i dag, det var Jason Ward. Programleder i dag var meg, Jonas Veland, og deg, Kaja Guttormsgaard fra Tax Justice Norge. Lyd, musikk og video er som alltid produsert av Kristoffer Lislegård, og Pengeland er en podcast produsert av og for Tax Justice Norge. Du kan høre på Pengeland der du hører podcast, eller se oss på YouTube, og det synes vi du skal. På gjenhør.
På gjenhør.